I never thought my own daughter would choose him over me. Susan sat in her kitchen, staring at the empty table in front of her. The sound of the clock ticking seemed louder than ever before. She had just come back from what was supposed to be a small family gathering, a celebration of her daughter Olivia's engagement to Richard, the wealthy businessman who had come into their lives like a whirlwind. Susan had always been the type to put family first, to give everything she had for those she loved. She had worked hard all her life, supported Olivia through thick and thin, and now she was left with nothing but a cold silence. The realization hit her like a sharp punch to the gut. Olivia had chosen Richard, her stepfather, over her. As the evening went on, Susan felt more and more like a stranger in her own home. Richard's presence, though charming to everyone else, felt like a wall between them. He had money. He had influence. He had everything Susan didn't have anymore. And Olivia? She had made her choice. Susan had tried so hard to keep their family intact, to hold on to the love and connection they once shared. But now, she couldn't help but feel that she was nothing more than an afterthought. She had always prided herself on being a strong woman, capable of handling anything life threw her way. But this was something she never expected. When Olivia came home, her eyes sparkled with excitement as she told her all about the lavish wedding plans, the extravagant parties, the future they would share. And yet, Susan couldn't help but notice the way Olivia's tone shifted when she spoke of Richard. It was as if Susan didn't exist in that picture anymore. Every word Olivia said was about Richard's success, about his wealth, about the life he had promised her. But where did that leave Susan? The mother who had sacrificed everything for her child was now left in the shadow of a man she barely knew. Olivia didn't even notice the subtle shifts. She didn't see how Susan's heart broke with each passing day, each empty conversation. But Susan knew. She knew that Olivia had made her choice. And it wasn't her. I've been replaced, Susan thought to herself. The realization stung, but it was the truth she couldn't ignore. She had loved Olivia with all her heart. But Olivia? She loved Richard, and that love came with a price Susan was unwilling to pay. And so, here she was, sitting alone in her kitchen, wondering when everything had changed. When did the love between mother and daughter fade into the background of wealth and ambition? She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but she knew that from now on, things would never be the same. She would never be the same. Susan closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let this destroy her. She wasn't going to let her daughter's choices define her. Not this time. The days after that dinner felt longer than ever. Susan sat in her living room, the air thick with silence. The weight of the house around her was suffocating. She had spent years making this house a home, raising Olivia, being a mother, doing everything she could to ensure Olivia's happiness. Yet, now, it seemed like none of that mattered. Olivia's absence was palpable. She hadn't been home in days, and when she did come by, it was as if Susan was no more than a stranger, occupying space in her own home. Richard had turned their family into a business deal, and Olivia was the prize. She had become obsessed with the idea of wealth, status, and all the perks that came with it. Susan could see it clearly now, in every smile Olivia gave Richard, every subtle dismissal of her, every look that spoke volumes about the shifting priorities in their lives. The worst part was that Olivia didn't even seem to realize the toll it was taking on her mother. She would show up, talk about her future with Richard, and how everything was falling into place. She'd speak about the grand plans for their upcoming life, the big house, the luxury trips. But it was all so far removed from the woman who had cared for her as a child, the woman who had been there through thick and thin. Susan remembered the days when Olivia would run to her with scraped knees, the nights when she stayed up late, soothing her through nightmares. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a memory fading quickly in the light of Olivia's new reality. Richard had woven his charm around Olivia, and now she was trapped in it. Susan could feel the sting every time Olivia spoke about him, every time Richard entered their home with that air of superiority that seemed to permeate everything he touched. He wasn't a man, he was a force, and Susan was just collateral damage. It hurt more than she cared to admit. Her daughter had chosen him. Susan wasn't blind. She could see it. The love she once had with Olivia was being slowly replaced with something shallow, something material. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about money. Olivia's attention, her loyalty, had been bought. and Susan wasn't sure how to handle it. She had always thought that no matter what happened, no matter the obstacles, they would always have each other. But now, it was clear that Olivia had outgrown her, and Susan had become the thing she could no longer afford to care for. It wasn't that Olivia didn't love her. No, it was more complicated than that. It was just that love had taken a back seat to ambition. Richard had made sure of that. As days turned into weeks, Susan began to realize that she couldn't sit back and let this happen. She couldn't let Olivia's choices define her. She was stronger than that. The house had always been her sanctuary, but now it felt like a prison. The walls felt like they were closing in, but Susan knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let them break her. She wouldn't let Richard and Olivia's betrayal be the end of her. It was time for her to take control back. She wasn't going to play the victim anymore. She would stand up for herself, even if it meant walking away from everything she thought she knew about family. The first step was simple. Susan picked up the phone, dialing the number of her old lawyer, the one who had helped her through her late husband's will. It was time to reclaim what was rightfully hers. She wasn't going to be swept under the rug any longer. As she waited for the phone to ring, a quiet determination settled within her. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. The days following Susan's call to the lawyer felt both long and suffocating. Every corner of the house seemed to remind her of what she had lost, what she was about to lose. Olivia hadn't been home in days, and when she did come, her presence felt as cold and distant as Richard's. The house, which used to be filled with the laughter and chatter of family, was now silent, echoing only the sound of Susan's own thoughts. She tried to push the hurt away, focusing instead on the task ahead. She had a plan. She had to reclaim control of her life, of her home, and most importantly, her dignity. The lawyer, Richard's old friend, had promised her he would help her navigate this legal battle. Susan knew it wouldn't be easy. Richard had power. He had money. But Susan had something that couldn't be bought. She had the truth. Susan sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. They were all legal documents, papers that outlined the assets that had once been shared between her and her late husband. She had signed many of them over the years, never once questioning their contents. Richard had always been the one to handle the business side of things. But now, as she read through them carefully, she saw something that made her stomach turn. Richard had transferred everything into his name. He had systematically removed her from every decision, every financial matter. She felt her blood run cold as she realized the depth of his manipulation. He had been planning this for a long time. He had set the stage, ensuring that she would be left with nothing. He had used his charm to win Olivia over, convincing her that his wealth was the only way to secure a future. And now, Olivia had become a pawn in his game. It was clear that Susan wasn't just fighting for her home. She was fighting for the right to be seen, to be heard. She wasn't just a mother. She wasn't just a widow. She was a woman who had the right to her own life, her own future. That night, Susan sat in the living room, looking out the window at the quiet street. The world outside was moving on, but here, in this house, she felt like time had stopped. She thought about how things used to be. Olivia had been her everything. She had raised her alone after her husband's death, giving her love, support, and guidance. But now, that love seemed to have been replaced with something cold, something that had no place for her. As the days passed, Susan continued her quiet investigation. She reached out to old friends, those who had known her and her husband before Richard came into their lives. They told her things she had never known, things that explained Richard's sudden interest in their family business, in their assets. It was clear now that he had always had an ulterior motive. He had never cared for Susan or Olivia. He had only cared for what they could give him. Susan felt a mixture of anger and sadness, but she also felt something else, strength. She was no longer going to sit back and watch as her life was taken from her. She was going to fight back, not with anger, but with the power of truth. She wasn't going to let Richard or Olivia dictate her life any longer. The next morning, Susan walked into the lawyer's office, her heart pounding in her chest. She was ready to face whatever came next, ready to take back her life. As she sat down across from the lawyer, she looked him in the eye and said, "I'm ready to fight." By the next morning, Susan woke up early, the sun barely peeking through the curtains. The house was still quiet, too quiet. Olivia hadn't come home last night, and that sinking feeling in Susan's stomach was becoming a familiar companion. She had learned to ignore the loneliness, to push through the empty spaces, but today, it felt different. Today was the day everything would change. The lawyer had assured her that her case was solid. She had the evidence, the facts, and most importantly, the resolve. There would be no backing down now. She made herself a cup of coffee, staring out the window as the steam rose from the mug. The world outside seemed to continue moving, while she sat frozen in her own thoughts. Susan knew she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. She couldn't ignore the fact that her daughter had chosen a life of luxury and status over the woman who had given everything for her. Olivia had been swept away by Richard's promises, his wealth, and his smooth talk. But Susan wouldn't let that be the end of her story. She had spent too long in the shadows of others, putting their needs first, always sacrificing herself for the family. But now, it was her turn to be heard. The phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Olivia. Susan hesitated before answering. "Mom, we need to talk." Olivia's voice sounded strained. Susan could hear the uncertainty, the hesitation. It was the first time in weeks that Olivia had sounded anything but sure of herself. "I'm not sure what you want to talk about, Olivia," Susan replied calmly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I know you've been distant," Olivia continued, her voice faltering. "And I've been thinking, maybe we've both been wrong. Maybe I haven't been there for you the way I should have." Susan felt a sharp pang in her chest, but she refused to let it show. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Olivia was starting to realize that the life she had chosen had come at a price, and now it was time for Susan to stand firm. "You can't undo what's been done, Olivia," Susan said softly. "You've made your choices, and I've made mine. But that doesn't mean you can pretend everything is okay now." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Susan could hear Olivia breathing, the weight of her words sinking in. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mom," Olivia finally said, her voice breaking. Susan took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been preparing for. She wasn't going to crumble. She wasn't going to let Olivia manipulate her feelings anymore. "I know, sweetheart," Susan said, her voice firm but gentle. "But you have to understand something. I've spent my whole life giving you everything, and I don't regret it. But now it's time for me to take care of myself. I can't keep living in the shadows of your choices." Olivia's voice shook. "I don't want to lose you, Mom." "You haven't lost me," Susan replied, her heart aching. "But I've lost you in a way. I've lost the daughter I knew, the one who cared about more than just money and status. And I can't keep pretending that I'm fine with that." There was another long pause. And then Olivia spoke again, her voice softer now. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to fight for myself, Olivia," Susan said, her voice unwavering. "I've already started. I'm not going to let Richard or anyone else take what's mine. I've worked too hard, and I've sacrificed too much. It's time I took control of my own life." Olivia was silent for a long time, and when she spoke again, it was with a resignation Susan had hoped for but never expected. "I understand, Mom. I'll support you, no matter what." Susan felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She wasn't going to let herself fall apart now, not when she was so close to taking back control. "I know you will," Susan said softly. "But this time, I have to do it alone." She hung up the phone and sat back in her chair, staring at the empty space in front of her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the right road. And for the first time in a long while, Susan felt like she was finally walking down it. She had taken the first step. The rest would follow. The next few days were a blur for Susan. She had taken the first step in reclaiming her life, but she knew the road ahead would be a long and difficult one. Her lawyer had been relentless, working through the weekend to gather everything they needed. Susan didn't sleep much. She couldn't. Her thoughts kept racing, replaying every moment with Olivia, every word Richard had ever said. But despite the overwhelming emotions, she couldn't afford to break down. Not now. The phone call from Olivia had shaken her, but it had also confirmed something deep inside Susan. Olivia was still her daughter, and even though things had changed, there was still a chance to rebuild. Susan knew it wouldn't be easy. Olivia had become someone else in the last few months, someone Susan didn't fully recognize. Richard had a way of pulling people in, making them believe they were part of something grand. But that was all it was, an illusion. He didn't care about Olivia, not in the way Susan had. Olivia had become part of Richard's world, a world built on material things, on appearances. But Susan knew better. She knew what it meant to love, unconditionally, to sacrifice everything for the ones you care about. And she wasn't going to let Richard's wealth erase that. The following week, Susan met with the lawyer again. She felt a weight lift off her shoulders as they discussed the next steps in the case. They were ready to file, but there was still one thing Susan had to do. She had to confront Richard. She had to make him understand that his manipulation wouldn't work anymore. Susan took a deep breath as she walked up to the front door of Richard's mansion. She had been here many times before, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't walking in as a guest. She was walking in to take back what was hers. Richard answered the door with that same smirk he always wore, his expensive suit a perfect reflection of his personality. "Susan," he said with a voice that dripped with fake sweetness. "I wasn't expecting you. Olivia told me you called." Susan's heart raced, but she kept her face calm. "I didn't call to talk to Olivia," she said, her voice steady. "I came to talk to you." Richard's smile faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "Of course. Please, come in." Susan stepped inside, her eyes scanning the house. It was still the same, grand, cold, and empty. She had never liked the way it felt here. It was all for show. "Let's get to the point, Richard," Susan said, her tone firm. "I know what you've been doing. I know about the accounts you've transferred into your name, the way you've tried to take control of everything. But it stops now." Richard's face darkened, his mask of charm slipping. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice cold. "You've always been too emotional. This is business, Susan. This is how things work." Susan shook her head. "No, this is my life, and I'm done letting you control it. You can't just take everything from me and expect me to sit back and let it happen. I won't let you." For a moment, Richard said nothing. He just stared at her, as if weighing his options. Then, with a smug expression, he spoke again. "You think you can take me on? You think you can win?" Susan stood tall, meeting his gaze. "I don't need to win, Richard. I just need to be heard. And I'm done being ignored." Richard's lips twisted into a sneer, but Susan didn't flinch. She knew this was just the beginning. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her anymore. As she left the house, she felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. She had finally stood up for herself. And now, there was no turning back. The next day, she called the lawyer and gave the go-ahead to move forward with the legal proceedings. She was ready. No matter how hard it got, no matter how much Richard fought back, she wasn't going to back down. This was her fight, and she was going to win. The days after Susan's confrontation with Richard passed in a blur. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, but the uncertainty of what would come next kept her on edge. Every phone call, every message, felt like a reminder of the battle she was now fighting. Olivia had been quieter than usual, and Susan couldn't help but wonder if her daughter truly understood the gravity of the situation. She had hoped Olivia would come to her, apologize, or at least offer some form of understanding, but that didn't happen. Instead, Richard's influence continued to loom over their lives. He was trying to intimidate her. She knew it. His smooth words, his fake politeness, all masked the same manipulation he'd been using for months. Susan had seen through it. She had to keep her focus. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about taking back control of her life, one step at a time. She had made the decision to fight for herself. But she also knew that Richard would fight back, probably harder than she could imagine. It didn't matter. She wasn't going to back down. The call came a week after the confrontation, just as Susan had been expecting. It was her lawyer, informing her that Richard had moved quickly, trying to block the legal process. He was challenging the validity of certain documents, trying to make it seem like Susan was overstepping. It was a common tactic, but it didn't faze Susan. She had prepared for this. The paperwork was ironclad. She had everything in place. It was time to take the next step. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the case file again. The weight of it all was starting to wear on her. She'd been running on adrenaline, but now, the exhaustion was starting to set in. It wasn't just about the money or the property. It was about everything that had happened over the years she'd spent sacrificing, giving everything for Olivia. And now, it felt like she was fighting just to be seen, to be heard. The phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was Olivia. Susan hesitated, unsure of how to approach this. It had been days since they'd last spoken, and she wasn't sure what Olivia wanted now. She took a deep breath before answering. "Hi, Mom." Olivia's voice sounded tentative, distant. "I wanted to talk. Can we meet?" Susan felt a pang of hope, but she didn't let it cloud her judgment. She was done waiting for Olivia to come around. This was her fight, not just for her daughter's love, but for her own sense of self-worth. "Of course, Olivia," Susan said, keeping her tone neutral. "We can meet. But I need you to understand something first. This isn't just about the money or the house. This is about my life, my choices. I'm done being pushed aside." Olivia's silence on the other end was heavy, but after a moment, she spoke. "I know, Mom. I've been thinking a lot. I made a mistake. I chose Richard because I thought it was the right thing. I thought it was the easy thing. But I see now how much I hurt you." Susan closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. This was what she had wanted to hear, what she had hoped for all along. But it didn't change the fact that Olivia had chosen Richard in the first place. It didn't change the betrayal Susan had felt. "I understand, Olivia," Susan said, her voice steady. "But it's not just about you choosing him over me. It's about everything that's been done behind my back. You've allowed him to take control of everything. And now, I'm taking it back." There was a long pause on the other end. Olivia's voice, when it finally returned, was softer. "I never meant to hurt you, Mom. I didn't know how to make things right. I didn't know how to balance everything." Susan's heart softened, but she couldn't let herself be swayed. "You can start by standing with me, Olivia. This isn't just about what's been taken from me. It's about us. It's about rebuilding trust." Olivia agreed to meet Susan the next day, and when the time came, they sat down across from each other in the same kitchen where so many memories had been made. But now, it felt different. The weight of their conversation, of everything that had been left unsaid for so long, hung in the air. "I'm ready to fight for us, for our family, Olivia," Susan said, her voice unwavering. "But I need you to be on my side, fully. I can't do this alone." Olivia nodded, her eyes full of regret and determination. "I'm with you, Mom. I promise." Susan took a deep breath. It wasn't the resolution she had expected, but it was enough for now. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, Susan felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but at least now, she wasn't walking it alone. The meeting with Olivia had been a small step toward mending the deep rift between them, but Susan knew the road ahead was far from easy. Olivia's promise to stand by her side felt genuine, but actions always spoke louder than words. Susan could sense the weight of the challenge that lay before them both. They were fighting not only against Richard's control, but also against the years of distance that had grown between mother and daughter. Despite the small victory, Susan couldn't help but feel that the true battle was yet to come. The next few days passed slowly as Susan prepared for the legal confrontation that would soon unfold. She spent hours at the lawyer's office, going over every detail of the case, making sure everything was in order. Each document, each piece of evidence was meticulously reviewed, and Susan felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. It wasn't just about winning the case. It was about regaining her life, her dignity, and her place in her own family. She couldn't let Richard get away with what he had done. It wasn't just about the money. It was about everything he had taken from her, everything he had taken from Olivia. She had to show her daughter that love and family weren't about wealth or status. They were about loyalty, trust, and respect. As the days wore on, Olivia started to get more involved. She came to the lawyer's office, sat through the meetings, and started to take the situation more seriously. Susan could see the change in her daughter. She wasn't the same girl who had been so enamored with Richard's wealth and power. Olivia was starting to realize just how much she had lost in the process. The realization was slow, but it was coming. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting with the lawyer, Olivia sat down across from Susan at the kitchen table. Her eyes were tired, and her face was pale. "I didn't realize how much I was losing, Mom," she said softly, her voice cracking slightly. "I thought I was doing what was best for me, but I was wrong." Susan reached across the table, placing her hand gently on Olivia's. "It's never too late to make things right," she said, her voice steady. "But we have to do it together." Olivia nodded, her eyes filled with regret and determination. "I want to help. I want to make it right, not just for you, but for me too." Susan gave her daughter a small, approving smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The next morning, They filed the papers. The legal battle had officially begun. Susan knew it wasn't going to be easy. Richard would fight back. He had the resources, the connections, and the ego to make this as difficult as possible. But Susan was no longer afraid. She had the truth on her side, and with Olivia now fully behind her, she felt a sense of strength she hadn't felt in years. The phone calls, the emails, the constant back and forth with the lawyer were exhausting, but Susan kept her focus. She knew this was the turning point. This was her chance to finally take back control of her life. And no matter what happened, she wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else take that away from her. The tension between Susan and Richard was palpable as they faced off in court. Richard, as expected, had all the charm and confidence that came with his wealth. But Susan wasn't intimidated. She had spent years building a life with integrity, and she wasn't about to let him tear it down. The courtroom was filled with tension as both sides presented their arguments. Richard's lawyer tried to paint Susan as an unstable, bitter woman who was only trying to tear apart the family. But Susan remained calm, focused on the facts and the truth. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure the truth came out. As the final arguments were made, Susan looked over at Olivia, who was sitting quietly beside her. For the first time in a long time, Susan felt like she wasn't alone. They were in this together. When the judge finally made his ruling, Susan felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had won. It wasn't just a victory in court. It was a victory for herself, for her relationship with Olivia, and for the family she had fought so hard to hold together. As they left the courtroom, Olivia turned to her mother with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I didn't see it before, but I see it now. I'll never take you for granted again." Susan smiled softly, pulling Olivia into a hug. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "But this is the start of something new." The battle was over, but the healing had just begun. The days following the court ruling felt like a strange kind of quiet. Susan had won, yes, but it didn't bring the kind of peace she had imagined. The house was still the same, the silence still lingered, and Olivia was still figuring out where she fit into this new reality. The relationship between mother and daughter was far from healed, but the first step had been taken. The truth had been revealed. Richard's hold on everything had been loosened, and now it was time for Susan to reclaim what was hers. But it was hard. The weight of the past few months, the tension, the fight, still felt heavy. Olivia had begun to spend more time at the house, but it wasn't the same. There was a distance between them that Susan couldn't ignore. They were in the process of rebuilding, but Susan knew it would take time. Time to mend the cracks in their relationship, time to rebuild trust. But for the first time in a long time, Susan wasn't afraid of the future. She had been pushed to her limits, but now she was in control. The house, the family, her life, everything was hers again, and she was going to make it right. One evening, after a long day of work, Susan sat down at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. She was going through the paperwork again, making sure everything was in order. She had learned over the past few months that she couldn't be careless anymore. She had to be thorough. She had to be strong. The doorbell rang, breaking her concentration. Susan stood up, wondering who it could be at this hour. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see Olivia standing there. She looked tired, but there was something different in her eyes. Something softer. "Mom, can we talk?" Olivia's voice was tentative, almost shy. Susan nodded, stepping aside to let her in. They sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where so many difficult conversations had happened. There was an awkward silence before Olivia spoke again. "I know I haven't been the best daughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so caught up in everything that's happened with Richard, and I didn't realize how much I hurt you." Susan felt her heart soften. This was the moment she had hoped for, but she wasn't going to let herself get swept away by emotions again. "I know, Olivia," she said quietly, "but it's not just about what you've done. It's about how we move forward. You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal. It's going to take time." Olivia nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "I know, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes. I want to make things right with you, Mom." Susan studied her daughter for a moment, weighing her words. Olivia was trying. She could see that now. The road ahead would be difficult, but there was hope. "It's going to be a long road, Olivia," Susan said, her voice calm but firm. But I'm willing to try. We both have a lot of work to do, but we'll take it one step at a time. Olivia smiled, her eyes welling with tears. Thank you, Mom. I promise I won't let you down again. Susan reached across the table, placing her hand over Olivia's. We'll get through this, she said. Together. The conversation was the beginning of something new, something fragile, but something real. Susan knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they had a chance to rebuild what had been broken. And that was enough for her for now.